We're live. It is Tuesday, June 9th, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. And Kate just said something outrageous about this show, which was, it was like being in a car for 75 days with your annoying brother who has delusions of being a talk show host. As that annoying brother, I can't decide whether to be outraged or deeply proud of that that description. I have to say the idea of being in a car for 75 days is itself appalling. Though I have occasionally had fantasies of doing the Trans-Siberian Railroad trip. Somehow a railroad car is bigger than like an actual car, and 75 days is really long. We have been doing this every day for 75 days.
Jeez.
1 hour a day with a drink and a guest. We're not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have a guest who is actually particularly interesting. And I have to tell you a story about
You say that like all of our guests are interesting. I hope they don't watch the show like after they're on.
Like Larry Lessig is actually really interesting. I want to tell you a flattering story about Larry Lessig. In a significant way from many law professors. Uh-oh. How am I now?
Okay, you're better.
Okay. Want to tell a story about Larry Lessig that he will not remember this, that meaningfully distinguishes him from other law professors. So I was a 27-year-old editorial writer for the Washington Post. And when you're a 27-year-old editorial writer for the Washington Post, you have a weird relationship with law professors, because on the one hand, they look at you with a fair bit of contempt because you are a fraud and you did not work appropriately for the position that you have. And they are very keen to pull rank on you and to remind you that you did not go to the elite institutions at which they teach. And one of them actually said to me when I asked a question about the weight of the world were on his shoulders there at the Yale Law School, "Oh, Ben, that's a very foolish question." And he couldn't answer that very foolish question, of course, but that's a different matter. It was the norm to be kind of reminded of your place in the hierarchy by law professors. But that was one side of the dichotomy. The other side of the dichotomy, which was equally important, was that they were supplicants before you because they all wanted the Washington Post to publish their op-eds. And so there was this kind of love-hate relationship. And there were a very small number of
It just sounds like
professors.
hate to me. Sorry, just
it was not love. I mean, it was a very weird relationship. And generally speaking, the more elite the law professor was, the more that tension was worn on the sleeve. And Larry Lessig was a remarkable exception to this. I would call him up sometimes and we would have conversations about all kinds of things, from net neutrality, where we had I remember, I think that was our last lengthy conversation in the Washington Post boardroom, to how a liberal like Larry Lessig ended up clerking for Richard Posner and Antonin Scalia, who famously said that life is too short for a liberal clerk. And he would just like talk about things as though you were a real person who was entitled to be part of the conversation. And I don't think he ever asked me to publish one of his op-eds. And so I came away from it with a decidedly positive impression of one Larry Lessig, and whose career I have watched ever since. We haven't been in touch in many years, but I have a warm spot in my heart for him because he was nice to, without affectation or pretense, nice to a young editorial writer without pulling rank. And so let that be a lesson to you when you become big and powerful and important. There's some young editorial writer who has good questions. You should just engage the person as though he's a real person. And maybe someday when that person is on a 75-day car ride with delusions of being a talk show host, he will sing your praises as a result.
I knew it would happen. I knew it.
Yeah, exactly. It was all calculated on Larry's part. Be nice to the help. All right, Larry Lessig, welcome to In Lieu of Fun. And I have to say, Kate, in the spirit of talking about the monologues, that one was fucking good.
Yeah, you did a good job, Ben. I'm kind of like the new monologue format. We did measured time in Boris Johnson news for a while, Larry, and then we measured it in Kim Jong-il news, and then Un news, and then we measured it in murder hornet news, and then we just dropped the news part of the show because it was getting too depressing. Yeah, it is so great to have you on. I mean, I don't think I need to introduce you. I think that most of the people here probably know who you are, but Larry is a law professor at Harvard. You have been a law professor at a number of very, very good schools. You were at Stanford briefly, and you were at Chicago. Am I remembering that correctly?
I was at Stanford for 9 years. I don't think that's briefly.
It was 9 years.
9 years.
They don't tell you, like, that someone did, like, you was there for a while, but I didn't. Okay, you were there for 9 years. Okay.
Yeah, and then I was at Chicago before that. Yeah.
Great. And author of like polymath is a great way to put it, but I mean, even beyond that, books about cyber law, kind of founding the field in a lot of ways. Most ways. I mean, the Code 2.0 is still essential reading for anyone who's written it. I actually pretty much did a whole reading of the entire oeuvre for my PhD in law, and your book and some of Jack Balkin's work on digital speech was some of the only were basically the only pieces that really stood the test of time. They were just absolutely still outstanding understandings and descriptions of what was happening. And so I'm really so happy that you're here today. I want to talk to you. You ran for president a couple of years ago. You have worked on copyright issues. You founded Creative Commons. You've just done a host of I don't know. I've always found it very fascinating how people move from one thing to the other. So I know it all probably makes perfect sense in your head. But I'm just kind of curious.
But wait, let's start there. What's the unifying thing? You've left out a big thing, which is Larry has done really interesting work in sort of constitutional theory and interpretation in the sort of translation world. So is there a unifying element that brings it all together, or is this, you just do a bunch of different things that are basically unrelated to one another? What's the unified field theory of Larry Lessig work?
That just sounds too grandiose, but if I have to be grandiose for a minute, I think I always am obsessed with the context of a field. So I did constitutional law, and I became obsessed with the presuppositions of the democratic culture that made that possible and the interpretive culture that made that possible. So the first of that work, as you said, Ben, thank you for mentioning translation, which I just published as a book last year, Fidelity and Constraint, after 500 years of working on that project, was about the history of American constitutional law. But I quickly moved into comparative constitutional law because what was much more interesting than the text of a constitution was the culture that made that text come to life. And then when cyberspace became a thing, and we still refer to it as cyberspace, it struck me that the context of technology, what was the architectural background or infrastructure and the values embedded in that infrastructure that made cyberspace live the way it was, or made values in cyberspace the way that they were. And then that drove me into activism for the first time when I got engaged in the fights around copyright. Really, at that stage, I felt like just a lawyer with a guilty conscience, because it felt to me like copyright lawyers in particular were going out there and mucking about with the internet in a way that was going to create lots of long-term harm to the potential of the internet. And that was that was the work that I did that became, I think the most prominent at the time. And then at a certain stage, a very close friend, Aaron Swartz, when I showed him the last book that I eventually wrote about copyrights, or that involved copyright, a book called Remix, he said to me, why do you think you're ever going to make any progress on these issues so long as we have this deeply corrupted political system? And I said, well, Aaron, that's not my field. And he said, you mean it's not your field as an academic? And I said, yeah, it's not my field as an academic. And so then he said, well, what about as a citizen? Is it your field as a citizen? And I felt like he had cornered me because, I didn't have an excuse. I mean, I had tenure. Nobody's going to fire me. I could work on whatever I wanted to work on. But I agreed with him fundamentally that we were within a democracy. This was about 12 years ago now. We were within a democracy that was deeply corrupted from the objectives of what it was to do. And we were not going to achieve anything, whether it's copyright regulation or internet regulation or climate change regulation or whatever, anything sensible, so long as there was this deeply corrupted political system. And that too was about understanding the context of politics and what made it so it didn't function. And that's the project that I launched myself on about 12 years ago. And unfortunately, it turns out we still don't have a well-functioning democracy. So I feel trapped. I can't liberate myself from the charge that Aaron Swartz gave me, especially since Aaron Swartz left and kind of left us with the work that we were told we had to do.
So you, based on that, had a presidential campaign that was relatively brief. What is your sense of democracy now? And given that running for president wasn't a strategy that worked, what is the way you're thinking about how to effectuate democratic structural change at this point?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I'm very sensitive about how we talk about this particular issue. So I'm going to say I tried to become a candidate running for president, and that wasn't possible, it turned out. When I began this project, my objective was to run a campaign that would put fundamental reform at the center of the debate. Because in my view, 4 years ago, nobody was talking enough about the fundamental reform of the political system that we needed. And so, based on our calculations, I was going to be able to qualify to be in the debates. And so even if that's all that happened, even if all that happened was that I would be able to be in the debates and they'd make this issue central to every other issue people were talking about, that alone would be reason enough to try to do it. And so I tried. I said if I raised $1 million in 30 days, I would run. I achieved that in less than 30 days, which made me, if you look at the whole field of people, including Republicans, the person who raised more money than half the field at that point. And then I started running. But then, of course, what happened was the rules for getting into debate evolved. So, initially you had to qualify by getting a certain polling in a certain list of polls. But the polls weren't including my name. So Bloomberg wrote this great op-ed editorial about how it's ridiculous that the rules exclude him because the polls don't include him, and they said he should be included. And then at the point at which I began to get the percentages necessary to get into the second debate, my campaign manager called me at the beginning of the week, the end of October, and said, we're going to make it. At the end of the week, the Democratic Party informed him that the rules had evolved. So they changed in a way that redrew the boundaries precisely to exclude the polls that had qualified me. So somebody wrote me and said, thus was Larry Mandering invented, because there were rules crafted to make it so I couldn't get into the debate. And so when that was clear that they were resolved that I wasn't going to be on that stage, it was, not possible for me to continue to ask people to support and send money to a campaign that would have no effect. So I stepped out. But the thing that I love to reflect on in, thinking back on that very difficult project, personally very costly project, is that, 4 years ago, it was hard to get people to focus on fundamental reform. This year, every single Democratic candidate and at least one of the Republican candidates, Bill Weld, made a commitment to fundamental reform in the first 100 days of their administration. And that commitment was exactly what I was trying to accomplish. It's public funding for congressional elections, number one. Number two, gerrymandering reform. Number three, equal freedom to vote, the restoration of the Voting Rights Act and ending suppression of opportunities for people to vote. And within the first 100 days. And so what's so empowering, exciting about where we are is that the world has come to recognize how fundamental this is. And though Joe Biden came to this at the end, unlike Elizabeth Warren from the very beginning, and even Bernie Sanders embracing vouchers as a way to pay for campaigns, I think that it's a measure of how salient that issue has become, that it's now obvious to everybody this is what we should do. So, I didn't get to be president, good for that. But I do think that the movement that I'm part of, I don't take credit for it, but the movement I'm part of is beginning to have an effect, to make it clear that we have a broken political system that must be addressed if anything else sensible is going to happen.
Yeah, I just to be clear, I always took that to be exactly why you ran, and actually thought you were quite successful in exposing that. Excuse me, I thought that actually the rewrite of the rules and was like the Larrymandering, as you called it, was actually ironically part of the entire proved your entire point to a certain extent. And I mean, unfortunately, and I thought that it was, I thought it was about, as we know, a few years ahead of its time. It kind of is terrible that we had to get to this place to kind of put us there. But I do think that this is something that is, I think that'll, as you said, it is obviously it has been broadly accepted, but also I think people will look at your run and see that effort for being that. I have a weird question, because I was just thinking about what you were saying about the increasing voting measures. And I'm curious if you have any views on voting during the pandemic. We've had Nate Persily on and a few other people who've been working really hard on this stuff. And I have long been a huge proponent of ending felon disenfranchisement. But one of the other things that I've always kind of toyed with the idea of is lowering the age of majority for voting. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, both on the pandemic voting and kind of just what maybe some of your specific platforms were on enabling people to vote.
Yeah, I mean, so first on pandemic, I think the Democrats made a pretty tragic mistake at the beginning of this tragic pandemic, and not sort of basically saying, look, we have two demands, and these demands will be met before we do anything else. And number one of those two demands is that everybody making $75,000 or less is going to have a program to guarantee 80% of their income. That's it. There's just there's no deviating from that commitment. And, that's close to even what Republican Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri was talking about. So it's not like it's a radical left-wing idea, but it was an essential idea to keep people committed to the idea of quarantining, because if they can't eat, if they can't live, they're obviously going to find ways to rationalize commitment to the quarantine out of their life. So I think that was a mistake that we didn't get that initially. And the other mistake was pandemic voting, which, obviously if in April, Congress had passed a law that said every state, at least for purposes of the congressional elections, which Congress has the power to regulate, and if they did it for congressional elections, they would obviously include presidential elections, has got to have an automatic vote by mail system. Automatic, everybody's going to get a ballot. Not this kind of request a ballot bullshit, everybody gets a ballot. And if they had done that, we would at least know that we're going to have an election. But the thing I'm most afraid of right now is as we see the resurgence of this pandemic, which has been caused for bad reasons and for good reasons. I mean, obviously bad reasons where people just didn't take it seriously. We're obviously going to see a resurgence because of this extraordinary movement of protest around George Floyd's death. There's a real chance that we come to November and states like Florida say, it's just not safe to have an election. We're just not going to have an election. And they are constitutionally empowered to cancel the election and just say, okay, we're going to pick our electors and they're going to be electors for the president because, of course, that legislature is controlled by Republicans and so too is the governor. So what I fear is the real loss is a clear path to a safe and effective election, which can't be argued with. And I'm just afraid we've lost that chance and we're going to have to fight all the way to the end to guarantee that we actually have an election. The question of lowering the voting age, I think, is more complicated. My other good friend, Kate, I have a couple of really good friends, Kate, but the other one I'll talk about now is Kate Silba, who's a professor at Boston University. She's written this really interesting piece about the cost to the psychology of kids to lower the age of majority. Like that majority, for criminal purposes, for drinking purposes, for drug, all of these things have an effect on the development of people, and that we shouldn't be so eager to drive down the age of majority. We should allow people to grow up and, have a period where they don't have the burden of that responsibility. I think it's a great and powerful argument. I'm not sure in the end I buy it, because I don't think that there has to be a grand unifying theory. And the reality is the world is screwed because too many boomers have too much power. People like me have too much power. And the only way we're ever going to fix that is if we find ways to get our kids to rise up and to demand sensible policy. Like the greatest moment in my household in the past 6 months was when my son turned to me, my 16-year-old son turned to me and rolled his eyes and he said, "Okay, boomer." And I was like, that's so great. We need this. We need that exactly. Because if we had a whole generation who just rose up and said, enough of this absurdity, the absurdity of not dealing with climate change, the absurdity of the politically corrupted system that sells results at the highest bid. If we just had enough people rise up, we could do something about it, and they're the people who could rise up. So I agree that's a complicated question, but I would be really eager to see at least 16-year-olds, like Germany is very eager to see the same idea, participate in the political process, because I think on balance the results would be much better than a bunch of older boomers who dominate the process right now.
Yeah, man, I love that. And I also think that the age of majority is I have not read Kate's piece. I'll have to. I've looked at a lot at Gideon Yaffe's work on risk assessment in children and basically moral culpability and when we can and then assessments of punishment and everything else. But I think that there is this two-sided coin of well, when you call something adulthood, you don't give people the chance to grow up. But then at the same time, we're sentencing 16-year-olds to life in prison. And so the problems that are attached to both of those things. But I do love that idea. I've always thought that. When I was a kid, I thought that but you get to make all of these rules for us, adults, and then we have to live in that world that you create for 18 years, and then we don't even have a large enough constituency for another 15 years after after that, or have enough money to make a difference or have enough anything. And so I think that's a tremendous point. I think that would, I mean, you look at the Greta Thunberg, you look at all of the the moments that we're having, including the protests right now. And they're shockingly full of youth. And I think that it's great to see.
Yeah, so why isn't the solution to that death? Boomers will be around for a while longer, but the actuarial...
And why are you Sarah Palin? Did you just turn this into a thing about death panels? What is
No, I'm not talking about panels. I'm talking about the inexorability of life not going on forever. And I agree that that the dominance of the political culture by the baby boomers, as a Gen X person myself, has been a deleterious feature of our politics for a long time. But it is a problem that will take care of itself with time.
Well,
And
but it may be too late, right? I mean, can we really wait another 20 years for these
Yeah,
problems?
and also people are dying later and later.
Yeah.
like,
yeah,
like
dying
that's
away.
like, I
but
mean,
remember,
oh
they die.
God.
Certain, you don't have to wait till all of them are dead, right? It's not a 20-year problem. A few of them, more and more of them,
Well,
die off every year.
Well, that's a really
And
fascinating thing. But like, why
and
don't
they
we
become
start
a less
creating
and
an
less
age of
important,
overmajority?
and they become a less and less important voting constituency. This is why it is harder for Trump to get reelected than it was for him to get elected, right? And so I guess my question is why the sense of urgency about it rather than the sense that generational change will take place with the generational change?
Well, the urgency is just that we have a fucking large number of urgent problems that we got to address. Like, we can't wait 20 years to fix climate change. I don't know if we can wait 5 years to address climate change, right? So, and the same thing with this corrupted democracy. Like, we don't have a system that convinces people that it represents them. It doesn't represent them, right? I got too many. You see these books back there, the red, white, and blue books there. So the latest book, there are too many here, so buy them so I can send them out. They don't represent us. It's all about the deeply unrepresentative political system that we've evolved. But what that does is it separates people from their democracy. And I don't think we can allow the corrosive effect of that to continue for another 10 years or so. So if this were 1990 and we were going to enjoy a decade of like Friends and the Seinfeld show, you can sit back and say, okay, fine, let's just wait for a generation to die off. But, we're in the middle of the worst crisis imaginable, 1918 plus 1928 plus 1968 in one bundle. And if we don't find an urgent political response to that, I'm terrified, literally terrified of, where we're going to be in 5 years. And I'm somebody who never was terrified. Like I talk.
I described you as an optimist.
No, right. No, I talk a good dark game. My brand is pessimism, and my books are deeply pessimistic. So don't get me wrong, I'll get in trouble with my publishers. But the point is, I really now fear where we are. This could easily spin in a really ugly direction. And though the last week and the protests of the last week have given me enormous hope, and especially because, exactly as you're saying, Kate, the people who were there were exactly the people that we need to be there. People who are, 25 and younger, who take the idealism of the notion of standing up and screaming for something seriously. If those people continue to do what they do, they can push us out more quickly.
Okay, so I want to come back to this. Pauline Brock, by the way, writes in the single sentence, as a proud boomer, I find this discussion hilarious. I want to isolate the point at which you went from playing a good dark game, but being basically optimistic, to being terrified. What was what year was that, and what caused the change?
Well, I think it's like in the last 2 years. Donald Trump becoming president was accidental in many ways. The screwiness of the way the Electoral College works, the screwiness of the hatred that both candidates had inspired, the extraordinary technique on Facebook and the like. So, it's not like that really revealed us, although it revealed a lot. The thing that really began to terrify me was the number of people who were complicit in what this man has done. The number of people who are just not willing to stand up and say, hell no. The fact that, it's people like Mitt Romney, and just Mitt Romney. I mean, how many other Mitt Romneys are there? And even what Mitt Romney has been willing to do, to resist him has been relatively small. And if it would be one thing if all we were talking about were small deviations in policy. But when you have a man who is attacking the basic premises of the institutions of democracy, of separated powers and a rule of law. And you don't have more people standing up and saying, what the hell? You can't do this. More people like George Will, Bill Kristol. People like that, I thought there would be many, many more of them. And
I agree.
When I began to see that they're just not there, I mean, there's some, and they move me. Like the whole Lincoln Project moves me. I think I'm giving more money to the Lincoln Project than to Democrats. I mean, because it's so exciting to see the power of that message, but it's not clear it will have any effect. And it's not that it doesn't have an effect on ordinary voters. That's a more complicated story. It's that there are people who go to bed at night knowing they're allowing this man to be who he is when they could do something to stop it. I think I can't decide whether this is an essay or a book, but I think America was born on August 8th, 1974. Because on August 8th, 1974, 3 pillars of American democracy were revealed in clear, powerful light. So one of them was the press had told a story that brought the most powerful man in the world down. So there was the picture of the press, and we romanticized, those of us who grew up in that period, romanticized the idea of the press, being able to speak truth to power and having an effect. The second was the courts. You had, the most powerful man in the world said, hell no, I'm not going to turn over the tapes. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, you are. And there's this famous interview with Berger, Chief Justice Berger, where the questioner says, so, what if the president had said no? And Berger said, without missing a beat, I would have lined the Supreme Court police up and we would have marched down Pennsylvania Avenue and forced him to turn it over. I mean, obviously a joke, but what he was revealing is the system depended on the courts having the willingness to step up and do what was right and everybody else giving in. And the courts. So number 2. And then number 3, the really most troubling part, if you look at the support for the President Nixon, among Republicans and Democrats, and leading up to about 6 months before Nixon resigns, Nixon's loved by Republicans about as much as Trump is. He's hated by Democrats about as much as Trump is. I mean, a little bit more extreme on both ends. But 6 months before he resigns, there is a perfectly correlated decline among support between Republicans and Democrats for Nixon. I mean, still in the end, Republicans like Nixon more than Democrats, but everybody began to respond to the story in the same way. And by the end, the famous troika of Republicans who walked across to the White House and told Nixon he had to resign brought about a picture of what public support meant. So democracy worked because the public came to a common view. All 3 of those pillars are now gone. The press, doesn't speak truth to power in a way that has any effect. The courts have been basically invisible. I mean, it's astonishing, the Supreme Court. I mean, I kind of predict the Supreme Court's got to do something in these Trump cases if they're going to, keep this image even alive. But the most troubling fact is if you look at Trump's support among Republicans and Democrats, both through the impeachment and through this pandemic, there's no change. There is no effect of the facts on these polarized partisan worlds, these tribalized worlds that we have. And so in my view, the image of an America that was driven by rule of law, by freedom of the press, and by a democracy that listened and learned and responded is gone. And I'm not sure how you run democracy without those 3 things together. But that realizing that those 3 things have disappeared is the most terrifying recognition that at least I feel like I've had.
Oh man, I feel like we just got a free TED Talk. That was amazing. I was like that.
So
But no, I'm not trying to be trivial. So what I'm thinking is I'm thinking about this. First of all, crazy fact about me that Ben already knows is that when I was so obsessed with All the President's Men, the movie, when I was like in 6th grade, that I had it. That was the movie for my movie night for my birthday party, and every girl passed out like completely. I was the only one still up watching All the President's Men in my sleeping bag. But I think that's like that. I think that the very reason that movie resonates is all of the things that you just said about what actually happened in history, because there is just this tremendous sense of civic, everything working as it should, even though everything worked as it shouldn't. And that's not completely true. There's lots of messiness there and like everything else. But I take your point. What I'm trying to figure out is if there are specific moments in the intervening, 46 years that you can specifically point to at which each of those pillars took a real hit. And I'm sure that there are, but one of the biggest ones for the courts, and I think of in like the opposite of the Berger quote that you referenced, is Bush v. Gore. And I don't know if you agree with that, but like that strikes me as like this moment in which the court was supposed to stand up and say something to the executive and to the process of democracy, and it really failed. But maybe I'm being overly simplistic.
Well, I mean, I think the press and the public decay together. The moment when the decay really begins is when Roger Ailes takes over Fox News. And there's this moment when Roger Ailes, is pitching his vision of what Fox News will be. And against the background of Fox News at the time, he comes into Fox News believing they were just going to be a kind of tabloid, more edgy version of a cable news channel, but still news in the model of, Walter Cronkite, just telling a story that everybody should be able to listen to. And what Roger Ailes says, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to pitch to our base. And the question is, who's our base? And he said conservative voters. And now, of course, when Roger Ailes did that, Roger Ailes was acting on a request that Richard Nixon had made of him. There's this famous encounter where Nixon bemoans the fact that the Russians have Pravda, the Soviets have Pravda. And he says, I need a Pravda. And, Roger Ailes is Nixon's television man. And of course, in 1972, there was no Pravda for Nixon. Obviously, that was revealed in 1974. But Roger Ailes built Pravda. Roger Ailes built a news channel that was focused on a base. And it turned out that business model was exactly the right business model for the profitability of these cable channels. Because if you look at the ideological content of these channels, you begin to see it really takes off after 2000, after 9/11 actually, that the Fox becomes, deeply conservative in its ideological content. MSNBC becomes, most people don't think liberal, but, still more liberal than Fox, and CNN bounces between, because it turns out that it's profitable to pitch to your tribal base, more profitable than to try to speak across the boundaries to everybody. So that profitability, that business model, drives them into the business of not helping us understand the world, but helping us rally the troops to one side or the other. That's one part. Then the public's part is we live in those universes. We live in these bubbles, and not just them, not just the right. We on the left live in these bubbles. And so, I was shocked when Biden exploded. I was shocked because in the feeds that I read, there was overwhelming support for Bernie. Like, there was just no doubt Bernie was going to be the nominee. And, I was coming to reconcile, would Bernie's candidacy be able to have the power against Donald Trump that it needed to have? And then, it blew up, it fell apart within a week. And all of a sudden I realized that part of the reason I was so surprised was that I myself lived in this bubble. I lived in a news bubble that reinforced my views and helped me believe what I wanted to believe. And that reality, I think is tied to the way the business models have developed. The courts is more recent. I think that I've been a big supporter, a lot of people hate me for this, but I've been a big supporter of Roberts in a number of important cases where I think he's done the right thing for the institution, even though in a fidelity to meaning sense, he's done the wrong thing for the Constitution. The most important example of this was the partisan gerrymandering case, where I think Elena Kagan's opinion absolutely is correct about what the meaning of the Constitution is with political gerrymandering. But I think Roberts was absolutely right to say the court should not get itself in the middle of this. It can't get itself in the middle of this. And so he was bending the meaning of the Constitution to preserve the institution of the court. Well, that sensibility, I think, should have informed the court to be more interventionist against this president. only this court could be interventionist against this president. He could not criticize 5 conservative justices standing up and saying to the president, you got to obey the law. You can't stonewall these investigations. All the list of things that he's done that go against the tradition and norms of our culture. And if they'd done that early and clearly, so the people in that administration, would tell the president, you can't just get away with this. You're not going to get away with this. It would have, maybe it wouldn't have stopped him. He's pathological. But the point is, at least there would have been a dissenter in the place of the courts. But I fear that, we're going to get to the end of this administration, assuming we in fact get to the end of this administration and the administration leaves. And there will be no really clear examples of the court doing what, Nixon versus the United States was.
So within the next few weeks, we should have a decision in the Mazars and associated cases. I don't think anybody knows quite where that's going based on the oral arguments, but do you feel differently about that point if it won't be a 9-0 opinion, but if there's a strong opinion that, the president's financial records get turned over, does that alter your sense of where the court has been, or is it too little too late at this point?
Yeah, well, the optimist in me, meaning the institutional optimist, the person who believes that we're going to get it right, can't help but believe that the court is going to say no to Trump. I mean, this is their last chance. And I think Roberts in particular recognizes the need to maintain the integrity of the institution, especially as the institution is increasingly perceived as just a political body, and they've got 5 Republicans or conservatives, so that's how they'll go. So I kind of think that they'll do that. And if they do that, I think that it's not a book anymore, right? Because if they do that, the picture of at least this part of democracy is saved. It doesn't make me happy because, I think especially we liberals have spent too much time depending on courts to get what we need in the world. I think that it was a fundamental mistake to spend so much of the 70s and 80s and 90s thinking that if we just got to the Supreme Court and got 5 justices on our side, we would make justice rule in the world. Instead, we should have been fighting to rally democratic majorities to that. So I don't think the court alone solves these problems. I think we have to build a political movement strong enough to reclaim integrity in our institutions. And, it's a million conversations to figure out how that's done. But I do think that there's an essential part, which is the integrity of the rule of law that only the court can assert. And I think that, especially now, if the court asserts it, it's kind of like Truman in the steel seizure cases. This is a moment when the court could get away with asserting it without fearing that the president has enough power to do anything about it. If the court asserted it, I think it would be extremely meaningful. And if they don't, I'm again terrified.
So I want to.
Yeah, go. We have to go.
We have to get to some audience questions. Andrew McMahon, who doesn't seem to still be on, asks, what is the most memorable anecdote you have from your time as a Scalia clerk?
Oh my gosh, there's so many.
Love, by the way, that's one of my favorite things. I'm kind of similar minded in this way. And I love it that you clerked for Posner and Scalia. Cause I've always, I think that it's just like brilliant move. And it just changes a lot to work among people you might disagree with.
I once had a lunch. Well, actually the last lunch I had with him. After that lunch, soon after he died, not because of the lunch, I think, but that was the last conversation we had. I told him that I thought that he had ruined me as a law professor, and he laughed and he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, I remember many times, but I can remember one in particular when, there was a principled Scalia, at least in the early stages of Scalia's jurisprudence, there was a principled conservative originalist, and there was a conservative." And many times a case would come up that conflicted on those 2 dimensions. Like there was the originalist thing to do, and then there was the conservative thing to do. And I remember one of the times that my co-clerk went into him. It was actually a case about qualified immunity. It's going to be very interesting when I think the originalists are going to end qualified immunity, and good for them that they do. But Scalia's initial instinct in this case was to go with qualified immunity. And my co-clerk just literally yelled at him, said, "You can't do this. This is completely unprincipled." And Scalia would always, get angry easy. I mean, he was a wonderful person to work for, but he'd get angry easy. And he screamed at us. He said, "Get out of my office! Out of my office!" And so we all left, and we're terrified that we were all going to be fired. And then he came in later, and he just looked at my co-clerk, and he said, "Okay, you're right, and that's why you're here." And it created an idea for me about what justice could be. I mean, because he was a Supreme Court justice. He could do whatever the hell he wanted, and he wanted to do the other thing, but he did what he thought he had to do to be the justice he said he was going to be, and that that defined him in my mind. That defined how I thought about the court, and it turned out that didn't predict much about what the court would do over the next 30 years of the jurisprudence of that court.
Or like any of the other lower courts necessarily.
I mean, it's an interesting story about the early Scalia. He got less capable of that.
Yes.
As the 90s wore on, but there were these issues that he was, particularly structural issues where his structural commitments were very deep. Adrian Gallo, the floor is yours.
Hold on really quickly before we go to Adrian, because we're on the topic. Matthew Chackoff, I'm just going to read it just so we can quickly do it. But he asks, and it's on the topic before we switch back to voting, that if Larry thinks that Roberts and the court should keep live streaming.
No.
No?
No, it's
really?
Yeah, no, I'm totally against it. Because you could even hear in those like crippled versions of live streaming the way in which the justices were listening to two different audiences or speaking for two different audiences. I think it's a mistake. If you turn the Supreme Court into, like C-SPAN in Congress, Supreme Court could easily become Congress. And if you look at Congress, the floor of Congress has nothing to do with deliberating about anything. It's about going to the well to speak to C-SPAN, and to speak to C-SPAN, not to persuade anybody of anything, except to rally your base or to attack the other side. I think that we have to recognize there are contexts for certain kinds of deliberation, and the deliberation of the court needs to not think about what the public is thinking as it deliberates or asks questions. And so, no, in this way, Scalia and I were total agreement. I think we should not have cameras in the courtroom. I think they should do their work anonymously and quietly, and we'll judge them on the basis of that.
All right, Adrian, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to return to a point you made earlier. And aside from the legislative hurdles, what are your thoughts on compulsory voting as a mechanism to make the American political system more representative? Or are there other low-hanging fruit to focus on that has a similar target outcome?
In principle, I'm not against mandatory voting, but it seems to be insult to injury. I mean, there are a lot of people who don't vote who have no good reason to vote. If you're in a gerrymandered district and you happen not to be wealthy enough to be giving money to members of Congress, and so you know that your vote's not going to matter, your voice is not going to matter, your money is not going to matter, why would you vote? Like, what is the reason to vote? I know you have a duty to vote, but I'm not going to say to somebody who's got 2 jobs and 3 kids, they need to go stand in the 2-hour line that they would have to stand in to vote because we don't fund voting in your district because you happen to be a minority district and we don't give a shit about you. So I think the first thing to do is to make it so everybody has a reason to be voting. So we don't have gerrymandered districts, which systematically discount people on the basis of political control. We don't have a way of funding elections. So the only people who matter are the 150,000 people who contribute enough to matter to congressional candidates as they run for Congress. We have a system that respects the vote and the process enough so that everybody is, in a critical sense, an equal citizen. And if they were that, then I'd be happy to say to them, and now you got a duty. Your duty is to show up and to vote. You don't vote, we're gonna punish you or gonna fine you. I actually think we should do the other thing, the American thing. We should pay them. We'll say, show up and vote and we'll give you $50. That's it. But we got to realize that it's rational for people to be disengaged in a unrepresentative, non-functioning democracy. And rather than moralizing against them, we should moralize against the unrepresentative, unfunctioning democracy.
Yeah.
Right.
I love that. I wanted to say something about the transparency comment, and someone brought up a good question do you want to go to David B's question, Ben?
Oh, sure. Hang on. David
Oh.
B. The floor is yours, David B. And Shailuv Gidwani, you're next.
So you were earlier commenting that senators and representatives were speaking to C-SPAN. What would you think about if you could wave a wand and ignore the constitutional amendment issue and just make the Senate to be elected by the state legislatures instead of a direct vote?
I think we learned that making senators elected by state legislatures was a mistake because it breeded corruption of the most grotesque form. Now, of course, you could say we don't have any less corruption today. If you read the stories that led to the 17th Amendment, the stories being published by the progressive press at the time, they would describe how anybody could just buy a Senate seat. And it was like a, sort of thing that you just did when you got rich. You bought a Senate seat. And it's hard to see that we're any further away from that today than we were back then. So I actually am not in favor of the idea of going back to legislative elections. I mean, I do think that you could imagine the governor appointing. So if the person turned out to be a corrupt fool, the governor would be responsible for it. But so that's just to say that's my position on it. It's not something I would fight for because I think there are other much more fundamental things to be fighting for. And that's the other half of the question, Adrian's question, that I wanted to make sure we get to. Like, what is the low-hanging fruit? Look, the low-hanging fruit is public funding of congressional elections. And the way to do that is vouchers. Everybody should have vouchers. And what was so exciting about this election cycle is to see people, first Andrew Yang come out to support vouchers. Kirsten Gillibrand came out to support ungodly amount of vouchers, $200 in every federal election, which means you would have $600 if you had an election where the president, senator, and congressperson was running. And then in the end, Bernie came out to support vouchers, and he gave the most impassioned, persuasive, I've been speaking about this for a decade, and I was bowled over by his argument in favor of vouchers as a way of funding elections over matching funds or anything else. This is something we could do tomorrow. And if we did it, the Supreme Court couldn't touch it. They would not touch it. And it would radically change the way this democracy functions. And so that's, I think, the low-hanging fruit. Sorry, I missed that before.
No, I think I love that idea. I wanted to just really briefly touch on the C-SPAN remark that you made, because I think about the performing about the court being on live stream and the performing and like congressional people going to the well and speaking to C-SPAN and not to their constituents and not directly to each other. You wrote this great piece in 2009 called Against Transparency. I don't think that this was your exact kind of angle, but I've gone back to it a number of times, especially as transparency becomes the thing that people talk about to build accountability into these social media platforms for online speech and censorship. But one of the things that I was struck by was and I'm going to bring these ideas all together in a second, but Dave Posner did this great study with, I forget who, I wasn't familiar, a bunch of political scientists basically analyzing the use of the First Amendment by candidates from either party in Congress on during all of the transcripts from every congressional debate and how many sides use it. And just in 1983, you look at all of these things for the last 200 years, and 1983, there's this giant spike in both sides using the First Amendment in debate and claiming the First Amendment represents their kind of ideas and kind of grandstanding on it. And I'm just kind of sitting there. I'm like, why in 1983? And Dave's like, I don't know. And then someone in the audience goes, oh, that's when C-SPAN started. And then everyone stood up, and all of a sudden you have this you have people, you have this radical transparency, being able to see into the floor of Congress all of the time. And all that creates is a performative a performative aspect to what was a kind of, in theory anyways, kind of a sacred moment of like debate and deliberation, and really turns the Constitution into a giant kind of a giant puppet that people are using to like promote their own politics and their own agendas. And I'm just like, this is, I don't think that ended up being the point of the paper, but that one thing just really stood out to me. And it strikes me as like you're against transparency and your C-SPAN comment kind of all together.
Yeah, I mean, the central point in that piece was to think about what I call the attention span problem. And so the attention span problem is, what if you have a problem that takes, let's say on average, 3 minutes to understand, or a story that takes 3 minutes to understand, but the average person rationally, not because they're stupid or not because they're lazy, but just rationally will only spend 30 seconds trying to understand it. What that produces is systematic misunderstanding of that issue because we don't spend enough time to understand it. We wouldn't. And what that suggests is that there are just certain places where we ought to think about certain problems and certain places where we shouldn't. So, I think that one thing we're learning in the slow democracy movement, which is like one way to understand democratic reform, is that we do politics well in certain contexts and not in other contexts. So we don't do politics well on Twitter. We don't do politics well in Facebook news feeds. That's not good for us. We humans can't do that well. We do it well on podcasts, things like this, places where the narrative engages humans at a human level and people can listen to the story and reflect on it. And that's because the complexity of politics requires contexts or architectures that encourage the depth of understanding that is needed. And I felt this, when I argued this case at the court about the Electoral College, I had this feeling like the way that they had structured the questions was almost like a Twitter debate. Like somebody would ask a question that genuinely required a careful understanding of 220 years of history, and you knew you had 100 words to answer it. I mean, we had worked it out, 100 words, that's all before you get cut off. And so the point is, some things are fine in 100 words. Like ask me my favorite ice cream, I can answer it in 100 words, I promise, even though I'm a lawyer. But other things like, what were the framers on about when they were creating something like the Electoral College? It's not that I'm stupid, or it's not that I haven't thought about it. It's just that it takes more than 100 words. And if we know that you're not going to listen beyond 100 words, then maybe we shouldn't be talking about it in that place. Not that it should be secret, but we should place in its right context the questions that can be addressed in that context.
You're reminding me of Dan Gahan with that kind of response. It's very Dan. That's such a Dan. And I think that you guys line up really beautifully on this point.
Yeah. Shailuv Gudwani, you get the last question.
Oh, great. Professor, my question was about kind of the packing of the federal courts by the, kind of McConnell regime, a young, unqualified, really highly conservative people. I think a lot of different people who look at kind of structural change have a lot of thoughts about ways we could redress this. What do you think a Democratic majority should do if and when it comes into power about this kind of packing?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is name it and shame it. Mitch McConnell is the Dark Lord. He is the Dark Lord. There is nobody worse than Mitch McConnell. Donald Trump is nowhere close to the evil that Mitch McConnell is, because Mitch McConnell is not pathological. Mitch McConnell is deeply committed to a set of objectives, political objectives, regardless of its effect on institutions or the democracy. And so what he has done with the courts is outrageous. And, it was bad enough when he would do it, and kind of hide it. At least there was shame associated with it. But when he came out and he said that if some justice retired after February of 2020, which was the equivalent moment at which Justice Scalia died in 2016, the argument he had made in 2016, which is that we shouldn't allow a president to appoint a justice in the final year before an election, he said he would throw that out. He, of course, would appoint a justice. And what was the difference? Well, the difference is that Now we have a president and Senate who are controlled by the same party. So the difference was simply politics, partisan politics. And the reason I think that's so evil is that you can't run our system of separated powers with core instincts driven purely by partisan politics. There's got to be an institutional and constitutional perspective here, and he has none of that. And he has done that with the courts. He's done that with money in politics. I mean, he thinks Citizens United was one of the greatest decisions of the Supreme Court, and he has done everything he can to destroy the FEC so it can't enforce federal elections laws and to stop any possible reform that would make it so we have a more responsive democracy. So all that's to say, the Dark Lord, should we respond to the work of the Dark Lord by, equal and opposite tit for tat? I'm really torn about that. On the one hand, I think it's justified. On the other hand, I just fear it would throw fuel onto the fire of cynicism and partisan understanding of the institution of the judiciary. And so, I would look for other techniques, other reforms that would not seem so partisan driven. I think the Supreme Court should be reformed. I think something more like the German Supreme Court, which has larger number of justices who are appointed effectively for a limited term, we could do that by basically changing the assignments of justices. So after 10 years on the court, you got to go work on a lower court. They'd retire pretty quickly. We could do all of that to address this problem in a way that wouldn't seem political. And my fear is that if we allow a solution that is too political, it's just going to fuel this decay in the integrity of that institution.
We need to wrap up. This hour has gone by very quickly. Larry Lessig, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you did this, Larry.
I'm grateful.
Kate, we have tomorrow Matt Miller, former Justice Department spokesman and general Twitter and cable news wit on subjects of federal law enforcement.
Bill Kristol's Thursday?
Bill Kristol is Thursday, and Catherine Rampell of the New York Times, who came to the Washington Post editorial page just as I was leaving it, and I think we overlapped there for 1 or 2 days, will be with us on Friday. So we've got a great week, second half of the week coming up. And until tomorrow at 5, Kate, what do we say?
We don't have fun anymore. So in lieu of fun, come hang out with us and burn everything down.
Yeah, burn everything down. And that's fun. Talk to you later.
Bye, Larry. Thanks again.